The letter wasn't just a letter. It was a declaration of war, printed on paper so thick and creamy, it felt like it had its own trust fund. I ran a calloused thumb over the embossed logo of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. It was a weeping willow, of course. Melodramatic, just like its president. Her signature, a flamboyant scrawl of ink and arrogance, was at the bottom. Brenda van der Kamp. The name itself sounded like an expensive handbag falling down a flight of stairs. The words were simple, direct, and dripping with condescension. My horse arena, the one I'd built with my own hands from plans my late wife Eleanor had drawn, was an unaesthetic agricultural feature, an eyesore, a blight on the pristine, manicured perfection of her suburban fiefdom. I was ordered to dismantle it within 30 days, or face fines that would start at $500 and double weekly. I folded the letter, a precise, sharp crease, the way I used to fold schematics for a power grid substation. I placed it on the worn oak of my workbench, next to a can of WD-40 and a half-disassembled carburetor. The air in my workshop smelled of pine sap, old oil, and the black coffee steaming in my mug. It was my sanctuary. It was the last place on earth that still smelled a little bit like her. The arena wasn't just some dirt patch with a fence. It was Eleanor's symphony. Every post, every rail, every inch of graded earth was a note in a song she never got to finish. She'd spent the last year of her life sketching it out in a worn, leather-bound notebook, planning it down to the drainage grade and the specific blend of sand and footing. "It needs to be kind to their joints, Arthur," she'd say, her pencil scratching against the paper. "Happy hooves make happy horses." After she was gone, building it was the only thing that made sense. It was a monument not of stone, but of cedar posts and hard work. It was my last conversation with her. And now, this woman, a woman whose primary contribution to the world was weaponizing beige paint swatches, was calling it an eyesore. That was her first mistake. I'd been an electrical engineer for 40 years. I designed and oversaw the installation of systems that powered entire cities. I've worked on projects with tolerances measured in micrometers and failure points that could cascade into statewide blackouts. My entire professional life was dedicated to a single principle: understanding a system so completely that you could control it. You identify the load-bearing walls, the critical pathways, the single points of failure. People, I had learned, were just poorly documented systems. Brenda van der Kamp was a system failure waiting to happen. She just didn't know it yet. I'd seen her operate. We all had. She moved through the neighborhood in her gleaming white SUV, a land yacht of German engineering, her face a serene, Botoxed mask that barely moved when she spoke. Her voice was a low purr of manufactured concern that could turn into a venomous hiss in a heartbeat. She ruled the HOA with an iron fist wrapped in a cashmere glove. Her board was a collection of hostages, a few financially dependent spouses, and a couple of meek retirees who had long ago learned that arguing with Brenda was like wrestling with a well-dressed eel. You just got slimed. There was the Peterson family, forced to tear down a brand new basketball hoop because it was an unapproved shade of orange. There was Mrs. Gable, a sweet old woman in her 80s, who received a formal citation because her garden gnomes were non-conforming lawn ornamentation. Brenda had a particular talent for crushing small joys. She was a black hole of happiness, sucking the color and life out of everything she got near. For years, I'd managed to stay off her radar. I kept my lawn immaculate. My fence was the regulation height. I paid my dues on time. I was a ghost, a quiet widower in a house full of memories, and that suited me just fine. But in attacking Eleanor's arena, she had done more than just issue a citation. She had trespassed on holy ground. She had put her manicured, acrylic-nailed hands on the last piece of my wife I had left. Big mistake. Huge. I went back into the house and poured myself another coffee. From the kitchen window, I could see the arena. Gracie, Eleanor's old quarter-horse mare, was standing peacefully in the center, swishing her tail in the afternoon sun. The cedar posts had weathered to a soft, silvery gray. It wasn't an eyesore. It was beautiful. It was a promise I had kept. The quiet, methodical rage began to build. It wasn't a hot, flashing anger. It was a cold fury, the kind that settles deep in your bones. It was an engineer's rage. Calm, patient, analytical. It was the feeling I got when I saw a poorly designed schematic, a system destined for catastrophic failure because of someone's arrogance or laziness, and I knew exactly how to deal with it. You don't argue with a faulty system. You deconstruct it. You find the vulnerabilities. You exploit them. And then you build something better in its place. I went back to my workshop and retrieved a brand new engineering notebook from a dusty box. It was a hardback, graph paper-lined beast, the kind I'd filled by the dozen over my career. I uncapped a fine-point black pen. On the first page, in neat block letters, I wrote, Project Nightingale. The second letter arrived 3 days later, delivered by Brenda herself. She didn't put it in the mailbox. She drove her white SUV onto the edge of my lawn, leaving 2 precise tire tracks in the damp grass, and taped the envelope to my front door. It was an act of dominance, a marking of territory. The perfume she wore, some cloying, chemical-sweet monstrosity, lingered in the air long after she was gone. This one was an official notice of violation and intent to fine. The language was more aggressive. The initial 30-day grace period had apparently been a courtesy she had decided to revoke. The fines would now begin in 1 week. I didn't get angry. I got to work. Project Nightingale commenced. Phase 1. Reconnaissance and documentation. That afternoon, I drove into town and made a few purchases. A digital camera with a powerful telephoto lens, a tripod, a parabolic microphone designed for birdwatching, 3 high-resolution, motion-activated security cameras. I spent the rest of the day installing them. One was mounted high in the eaves of my workshop, giving it a perfect, unobstructed view of the front of Brenda's house across the street. Another was disguised in a birdhouse overlooking my own front gate. The third was aimed directly at the arena itself. I ran the cables through the attic, down the walls, and into a dedicated server I set up in my study. By nightfall, I had a 24/7 high-definition record of every movement on my property and hers. I opened my notebook. The first section was labeled Documentation. I began a log. Every entry was time-stamped. 1742, Brenda Vanderkamp parks white SUV on lawn. 1743, affixes envelope to front door. 1745, departs. Noticeable tire impressions left in turf. I photographed the tire tracks. I photographed the letter taped to my door. I photographed the envelope. I scanned the letter itself. Everything was saved, cataloged, and backed up to 3 separate hard drives. In my old job, we called it triple redundancy. You never trust a single point of failure. Phase 2. Research. My evenings, once spent quietly reading or tinkering in the shop, now had a new purpose. I became a scholar of suburban warfare. I downloaded the complete HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions, all 148 pages of them. I printed the entire document and put it in a 3-ring binder. Then I went to the county clerk's website. I pulled the original plat maps for the entire Willow Creek development. I pulled the property records for my lot, and for Brenda's. I downloaded the county zoning ordinances, agricultural codes, and building regulations. My desk looked like a command center. Maps, binders, and legal documents were spread out under the bright glow of my drafting lamp. I read every line. I highlighted, I cross-referenced, I made notes in the margins. I treated the HOA bylaws not as a set of rules, but as a system schematic. I was looking for contradictions, for ambiguities, for loopholes. I was looking for the architectural flaws in Brenda's fortress. She escalated, just as my analysis predicted she would. The letters became daily. They started arriving via certified mail, forcing me to sign for them. They were filled with legalese that was clearly cut and pasted from a website, full of whereas and heretofore clauses that sounded impressive but meant little. The fines accumulated on paper: 500, 1,000, 2,000. It was a campaign of intimidation, designed to bully and overwhelm. I simply logged each one. I scanned them, filed them, and added them to the growing mountain of evidence in Project Nightingale. I did not respond. I did not call. I did not engage. To her, my silence must have seemed like fear or submission. She couldn't comprehend that it was observation. A predator doesn't roar while it's stalking its prey. It watches, it waits, it learns. While I was mapping out the legal landscape, my cameras were doing their work. They recorded the rhythm of Brenda's life, the landscapers who came on Tuesdays, the pool boy on Wednesdays, the endless parade of Amazon delivery trucks. And then I noticed something else, something that didn't fit the pattern. Every few days, usually after dark, an expensive car with out-of-state plates would pull into her driveway. The driver would go inside for no more than 15 minutes, and then leave carrying a small designer pet carrier. It was odd. It was a deviation from the baseline. And in systems analysis, you always pay attention to the deviations. I started a new section in my notebook: anomalous activity. Using the telephoto lens, I began documenting the license plates. I ran them through a public record search. New York, California, Florida, wealthy owners, all of them. What was a woman in a quiet suburban neighborhood in the middle of the country doing with a rotating cast of luxury vehicles from across the nation? The breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday night, about 3 weeks into my investigation. A black Mercedes with Texas plates pulled up. A woman in a fur coat in September scurried to the door. I had the parabolic microphone aimed at an open window on the side of Brenda's house. The sound was faint, distorted by the rain, but I could hear fragments. The new litter is exquisite. Champion bloodline. 10,000 is my final offer. And then Brenda's voice, clear as a bell for just a moment. For that price, I expect cash, darling. This is a private transaction. My pen flew across the page. A private transaction. Champion bloodline. I went online and started digging, using keywords from the conversation. It didn't take long. I found a slick, password-protected website advertising elite Imperial Pomeranians. There were no names or addresses, just a contact form and photos of ridiculously fluffy dogs with eye-watering price tags. The website's registration was hidden behind a proxy service, but a little more work revealed the IP address of the server it was hosted on, and that IP address traced back to a residential account, Brenda Vanderkamp's residential account. I leaned back in my chair, the worn leather groaning in protest. A wide, slow smile spread across my face. It was beautiful, exquisite. I turned to the HOA bylaws, the massive binder on my desk. I flipped to Section 9, Article 4, Commercial enterprises. The text was unequivocal. No trade, business, or commercial activity of any kind shall be conducted in or from any residence. Brenda van der Kamp, the arch-enforcer of the rules, the self-appointed guardian of neighborhood purity, was running an illegal, unlicensed, cash-only puppy mill out of her McMansion. She was violating the very document she was using to terrorize me. It was more than hypocrisy. It was a critical system vulnerability. It was leverage. But that wasn't even the best part. The real discovery, the one that would serve as the foundation for my entire counteroffensive, came later that night. I was bleary-eyed, poring over the original plat maps from the 1970s, back when this whole area was just farmland. My property was one of the original parcels, an old 5-acre plot with a farmhouse that had been torn down long ago. The Willow Creek Estates development had been built around it in the late 90s, and there it was, a tiny, almost unreadable note in the margins of the county zoning charter for my specific parcel number. Designation 4B, Rural Residential/Light Agricultural Use. Pre-existing designation grandfathered in perpetuity. I felt a jolt, like I'd touched a live wire. I cross-referenced it with the HOA's founding documents, and I found the kill shot, a single sentence buried deep in the appendices, a line their own lawyers had probably insisted on to protect them from unwinnable lawsuits. The covenants and restrictions of this association shall not supersede any pre-existing and duly recorded county zoning designations. They had no jurisdiction, none of it. The letters, the threats, the fines. It was all a bluff. A house of cards built on the assumption that no one would ever bother to read the fine print. Brenda wasn't just a bully. She was an incompetent one. She had the authority of a queen, but her castle was made of sand. I closed the notebook. The investigation phase was over. It was time to move on to the design phase. The old rage was gone, replaced by something else. A profound, almost joyful sense of purpose. A craftsman's satisfaction. I had deconstructed the system. I had found its fatal flaws. Now, I was going to engineer a solution. Brenda wanted to complain about my unaesthetic agricultural feature. Fine. I was going to give her something truly agricultural to look at. I was going to give her exactly what she deserved, with interest. I went to my drafting table, pulled out a fresh sheet of vellum, and began to draw. The plan was multifaceted, a cascade of precisely timed actions designed for maximum impact. It wasn't enough to win. She had to be publicly, comprehensively, and humiliatingly defeated. Her power was built on perception, on the illusion of untouchable authority. I was going to shatter that illusion in front of the very people she terrorized. First, the arena. She called it an eyesore. I decided to make it a spectacle. I spent 2 days at my drafting table designing a professional, stadium-grade lighting system. It was a beautiful piece of engineering. 4 galvanized steel poles, 50 feet tall, set in deep concrete footings. Each pole would be topped with a custom array of high-efficiency LED floodlights. I calculated the precise angles to illuminate the entire 100 by 200-foot arena with perfectly even, shadowless light, while minimizing light spill onto adjacent properties. I even ran a photometric analysis on my computer to ensure it was all perfectly compliant with county codes for nighttime agricultural operations. It was, to the lumen. I called my old foreman, a man named Sal, who owed me a favor or two. I explained the situation. When I got to the part about the HOA president and the garden gnomes, I could hear him chuckling on the other end of the line. "Artie, you old dog," he said. "Malicious compliance. I love it. The boys and I are free next weekend. We'll bring the auger and the crane. You just supply the beer and burgers. My old company sold me the poles and fixtures at cost. Professional courtesy. They were delivered on a flatbed truck the following Thursday. The sight of a semi-truck navigating the pristine, curving streets of Willow Creek Estates caused a minor sensation. Brenda stood on her porch, her arms crossed, her face a thundercloud. I gave her a polite, neighborly wave. Her face tightened, the Botox fighting a losing battle against her fury. While the physical components of my plan were coming together, I worked on the legal and social fronts. I contacted a young, hungry lawyer, the son of an old fishing buddy. I laid out the contents of Project Nightingale on his conference table. The binder of bylaws, the zoning maps, the surveillance logs, the evidence of Brenda's unlicensed business. His eyes widened as he went through it. "Mr. Finch," he said, pushing his glasses up his nose. "This isn't just a case. This is a work of art. Her harassment is baseless, and you have her dead to rights on the commercial enterprise violation. That's not just an HOA issue. That's tax evasion." He drafted a cease and desist letter that was a masterpiece of legal threat and prepared a lawsuit against Brenda personally for targeted harassment and against the HOA for selective and malicious enforcement. We would wait to file it. The timing had to be perfect. Next, I took a walk. I visited the Petersons, the family who'd lost their basketball hoop. I visited Mrs. Gable, the gnome lady. I showed them a condensed version of my findings. I showed them the zoning laws that proved Brenda was acting outside of her authority. I showed them the proof of her illegal business. A spark of rebellion, long suppressed, lit up in their eyes. They eagerly agreed to provide sworn affidavits about their own experiences with her bullying. I was no longer a lone operative. I was building a coalition. The final piece of the puzzle was the arena itself. It wasn't enough to just light it up. It had to have a purpose, a noble purpose. I reached out to 2 local organizations. The first was the County 4-H Club, which was always looking for safe, well-maintained spaces for their youth equestrian programs. The second was a nonprofit I'd read about that provided equine-assisted therapy for veterans suffering from PTSD. Both were ecstatic. I drew up formal agreements offering them free and unlimited use of the Eleanor Finch Memorial Arena for their evening programs. Suddenly, my Eyesore was a pillar of the community, a center for youth development and a place of healing for our nation's heroes. Let her try to tear that down. The Saturday of the installation was a glorious sunny autumn day. Sal and his crew arrived at dawn. The rumble of the crane and the diesel auger was a beautiful sound. We had the holes dug and the concrete poured by 10. By noon, the first 50-foot pole was being lifted into place. Neighbors drifted out of their houses, drawn by the commotion. They stood in small, silent groups, watching. It felt like a revolution. Brenda's front door opened and she stormed across her lawn, her face a mask of pure rage. "What is the meaning of this, Arthur?" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "This is a flagrant violation. You did not get approval from the Architectural Review Committee." I was standing by the work truck, holding a clipboard and pretending to check a schematic. I looked up, feigning mild surprise. "Brenda," I said, my voice calm and even. "This is a fully permitted agricultural lighting installation, compliant with all county ordinances for my zoned property use. I don't need the committee's approval." I tapped the county permit taped to the truck's window. "But I do appreciate your concern for the aesthetic." She stared at me, sputtering. She was a system encountering an unexpected input, and her programming was failing. She had no response. She just spun around and stomped back to her house. The slamming of her front door echoed across the neighborhood. By dusk, all 4 towers were up. The wiring was complete. Sal stood beside me, a can of beer in his hand. "All right, Artie," he grinned. Moment of truth. I walked over to the control box I'd installed on the side of my workshop. It had a large, satisfyingly industrial-looking switch. I took a deep breath. This was for Eleanor. I threw the switch. There was a low hum, a click of relays, and then the arena exploded with light. It was a clean, pure, beautiful white light, turning the sand to a golden carpet and the weathered gray fences to silver. It was brighter than day. It was magnificent. It was glorious overkill. From across the street, I could hear a faint, strangled scream. The annual HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Wednesday. It was the perfect venue for the climax, the final act of Project Nightingale. The clubhouse was packed. Brenda's campaigns of terror had ensured high attendance. People came more out of fear than community spirit. She stood at the podium, radiating smug authority, going through the usual agenda items, budget approvals, landscaping contracts, the announcement of a new, even more restrictive policy on mailbox colors. Her board of directors sat behind her, looking bored and resigned. When she got to the new business and open forum section, she made a point of looking right at me. "Does anyone have any legitimate community concerns to discuss?" she asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. That was my cue. I stood up. "I do," I said, my voice carrying easily in the suddenly silent room. I walked to the front, carrying my laptop and a small projector. "What do you think you're doing?" Brenda hissed, her microphone amplifying the venom in her voice. "I've prepared a short presentation on property rights and bylaws compliance within our community," I said cheerfully, setting up the projector. "I think everyone here will find it very educational." Before she could stop me, the first image flashed onto the screen behind her. It was the county plat map, with my property highlighted in bright yellow. I began to speak, my voice steady and clear, the voice of an engineer presenting a technical briefing. I walked them through it, step by step. I showed them the original zoning designation for my land. I showed them the light agricultural use clause. Then I put the text from their own HOA bylaws on the screen, the one that said county zoning superseded their authority. A murmur went through the crowd. People were leaning forward, looking at each other. The foundation of Brenda's power was beginning to crack. "As you can see," I concluded that section, "the HOA has no legal authority over the structures on my property. All of the violation notices, the threats, and the fines levied against me are therefore null and void. They are legally meaningless." Brenda's face was pale. This is an outrage. You can't just—" "But I'm not finished," I said, cutting her off smoothly. "I believe in the importance of following the rules. So now, let's discuss an actual documented violation of our community's most sacred covenants." The next slide was a picture of a fluffy Pomeranian, taken from Brenda's own secret website. Below it, the price. $12,000. The room filled with gasps. I clicked to the next slide. It was a photo of the black Mercedes with Texas plates in her driveway, taken with my telephoto lens. The next slide was the same car, leaving, with the owner carrying a pet carrier. The next was a car from Florida. The next, from California. I presented a calendar, showing the dates of more than 24 such private transactions over the last 3 months. Then I played the audio. Her voice, tinny but clear, filled the room. $10,000 is my final offer. I expect cash, darling. Section 9. Article 4 of the bylaws you enforce so vigorously, Brenda, I said, turning to face her directly, explicitly forbids any commercial enterprise. Yet for the past 2 years, you have been running an unlicensed, undeclared, cash-only luxury dog breeding business from your home. The mask didn't just crack, it shattered. Lies, she shrieked, her voice a raw, ugly thing. Slander! This is an invasion of my privacy. You're a monster. I'll sue you for everything you have. I don't think you will, I said calmly, because a lawsuit involves a process called discovery, and I've estimated, based on your own prices and the frequency of your sales, that you have an undeclared income of approximately $200,000 a year. I'm not a tax expert, but I imagine the IRS would be very interested in that. In fact, I believe they are. Right on cue, the main doors of the clubhouse swung open. 2 men in crisp, sober suits and a woman in a county animal welfare uniform stepped inside. One of the men held up a badge. Brenda Vanderkamp? He asked, his voice calm but implacable. I'm Agent Miller with the Treasury's Criminal Investigation Division. We have a warrant to search your property. The color drained from Brenda's face. She looked like a ghost. Her whole world, her entire carefully constructed empire of petty tyranny, had evaporated in the space of 10 minutes. She swayed on her feet, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. The satisfying metallic click of handcuffs being snapped onto her wrists was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. The aftermath was, as they say, total. Brenda Vanderkamp was buried under an avalanche of state and federal charges. Tax evasion was the big one, but the animal welfare violations were just as grim. Her house, the pristine white palace from which she had ruled, was seized under asset forfeiture laws. The contents were auctioned off to pay a fraction of her fines and back taxes. She was sentenced to 5 years in a federal facility. Her reign was over. The HOA was in shambles. Faced with a class action lawsuit from me, the Petersons, Mrs. Gable, and a dozen other families who came forward, the old board resigned in disgrace. A new board was elected, composed of reasonable people who promptly rewrote the bylaws, gutting the most restrictive and ridiculous rules. The Architectural Review Committee was disbanded entirely. Mrs. Gable's gnomes returned to her garden in a triumphant, colorful parade. I won my lawsuit, of course. The settlement from the HOA's insurance policy was substantial, but the money was never the point. I used it to create the Eleanor Finch Memorial Foundation. The foundation's first act was to formally partner with the 4-H Club and the Veterans Therapy Group. We upgraded the arena footing to the exact specifications Eleanor had dreamed of. We built a small, comfortable viewing stand for parents and families. We funded scholarships for kids who wanted to study agriculture or veterinary science. We ensured the equine therapy program would be fully funded, forever. The arena, Brenda's Eyesore, is now the heart of our community. Several nights a week, the lights click on, bathing the space in that clean, white glow. The sounds that drift across the neighborhood are no longer the shrieks of a petty tyrant, but the laughter of children learning to ride, the quiet murmur of a veteran finding peace with a gentle horse, the happy thud of hooves on soft ground. Sometimes in the evenings, I sit on my porch with a cup of coffee and watch. I see Gracie, my old mare, being gently groomed by a young girl from the 4-H Club. I see the lights, my 4 silent sentinels, standing tall against the twilight sky. They're more than just lights. They are a statement. They are a monument to my wife, yes, but they are also a monument to the simple, powerful idea that bullies only have the power you give them. Brenda's mistake was thinking the world ran on threats and intimidation. She didn't understand that the world actually runs on systems, on physics, on rules and regulations, and the fine print that people like her are too arrogant to ever read. She saw an old man and a patch of dirt. She couldn't see the engineer, the man who spent a lifetime learning how to read the schematic, find the weakness, and flip the switch. And when I flipped that switch, I didn't just light up an arena. I lit up a whole community. And that, I think, is a system that would have made Eleanor very, very proud. Peace, it turns out, isn't always quiet. Sometimes it's brilliantly, beautifully, and vindictively lit.